3 days after his wife vanished into the water off the coast of the Bahamas, Brian Hooker picked up his phone and made a private call to a friend. For 40 minutes, he walked through every detail of what happened that Saturday night. The wind speeds, the wave heights, the exact moment Lynette went over the side of their 8-foot dinghy and never came back. He spoke calmly, methodically, like a man building an account rather than a man falling apart. He believed no one beyond the man on the other end would ever hear what he was about to say. He was wrong. That friend, fellow sailor Blaine Stevenson, was recording every word, and when that recording went public 8 days later, it exposed something far more disturbing than a tragic accident at sea. It exposed a timeline that doesn't add up, scientific impossibilities in a former Marine's own story, and a single unanswerable question that has haunted investigators ever since. How does an experienced sailor lose his wife in 10 feet of crystal clear water during a 4-minute boat ride, and why can't anyone find her body 18 days later? Before we go further, if stories like this, where the evidence doesn't match the explanation and the truth hides somewhere in the details, are the kind of investigations you want to see more of, take a second right now to hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Files. We don't just cover cases, we break them down piece by piece, timeline by timeline, until the contradictions reveal themselves. And this case has contradictions that will stay with you long after this video ends. Now, to understand why that 40-minute phone call has become the centerpiece of a dual criminal investigation by both the United States Coast Guard and the Royal Bahamas Police Force, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the incident itself, but the beginning of the friendship that would eventually lead to that recording being made in the first place. Because the man who pressed record wasn't some stranger looking for internet clout. He was someone Brian and Lynette Hooker had known for more than 2 years, someone they had trusted, someone who had become part of their small, tight-knit world inside the American cruising community. The cruising community is a unique subculture. These are people who have left behind traditional homes, traditional jobs, and in many cases traditional lives entirely to live full-time on sailboats, drifting from Florida down through the Caribbean islands, anchoring in the same bays, dealing with the same weather, swapping notes about the same anchorages. It's a small world, and the Hookers and the Stevensons had been part of that world together since late 2023. They met in Bradenton, Florida, anchored near each other, sharing meals and stories the way sailors do when they find people who understand the lifestyle. By Blaine Stevenson's own account, they ate dinner together often. They sailed the same waters. They helped each other with the same standard problems that come with living on a boat year-round. And over those 2 years, the friendship deepened. Marn Stevenson, Blaine's wife, became close enough to Lynette that by 2024, Lynette was sending her private messages about her marriage, the kind of messages you only send to someone you trust completely. So when the framing started to emerge in comment sections and social media posts after the recording went public, framing that painted Blaine Stevenson as a vulture who exploited a grieving man in his darkest hour, that framing collapsed the moment anyone looked at the actual relationship. Stevenson didn't record a stranger. He recorded a friend, and by his own admission on national television, he recorded that friend because he no longer believed the story he was being told. Brian Hooker and Lynette Hooker had been married for 25 years. They had been sailing together for more than 12 of those years, and for the last 4 years, they had been living full-time aboard their 46-foot sailboat, a vessel they had named Soulmate. Brian described their dynamic to CBS News as more like co-captains than traditional sailor and crew. There were certain jobs he handled, and certain jobs she handled because a boat that size requires 2 people working in sync to run efficiently. Lynette wasn't just along for the ride. She was an experienced sailor in her own right, someone who knew the water, knew the weather, and knew how to handle herself in conditions that would intimidate most recreational boaters. Brian himself came from a background that should have prepared him for almost any emergency on the water. He was a former United States Marine, a man trained to stay calm under pressure, to make decisions in chaotic situations, and to follow protocols that exist specifically to prevent disasters. He was also a former union leader, someone who, by Blaine Stevenson's own description, had stood up for people in difficult political climates and had a reputation for being steady, reliable, someone you could count on. That background makes what happened on the evening of April 4, 2025, even harder to reconcile with the account he would later give. The day began the way many Saturdays had begun for the Hookers over the previous 4 years. Soulmate was anchored at the south end of Aunt Pat's Bay, off the coast of Elbow Cay, in the Abaco Islands of the Bahamas. The weather was typical for early April in that part of the world. Warm, breezy, with the kind of conditions that draw sailors from all over the United States down to the islands every winter and spring. Brian and Lynette took their 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy out into the channel that morning for what was supposed to be a regular day on the water. Their first stop was a place called Tahiti Beach, a popular spot among the cruising community that dries out at low tide, where a barge pulls up during the day and serves drinks to anyone willing to anchor nearby and wade out to the sandbar. From Tahiti Beach, the couple motored their small dinghy across to a restaurant near Hopetown, a tiny island village known for its iconic red and white striped lighthouse. The restaurant was called the Abaco Inn, and according to a manager there who later spoke to CBS News, the establishment has been cooperating fully with authorities but has declined to say anything more publicly. We don't know what Brian and Lynette did at the Abaco Inn. We don't know how long they stayed. We don't know what they talked about, or whether anything unusual happened during that visit. What we do know, because it has been confirmed by the Royal Bahamas Police Force, is that they left the harbor near the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 in the evening local time. That departure time matters more than almost any other detail in this entire case, because everything that follows is built on top of it. 7:30 in the evening, in the Bahamas in early April, means the sun is still up, but not for long. Brian himself would later estimate to his friends that the sun was about 10 minutes from setting when they departed. A local charter captain named Mo Monestime, a man who has spent 15 years working the waters around Great Abaco Island, was later asked by Fox News Digital to recreate the route Brian and Lynette would have taken that evening. Monestime explained that the route calls for a turn to the southwest after clearing the harbor, then a short ride between the western coastline of Elbow Cay and the eastern coastline of a smaller island called Lubber's Quarters. In normal conditions, Monestime estimated, the entire ride from the harbor back to an anchorage in Aunt Pat's Bay takes about 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That is the length of the boat ride during which, according to Brian Hooker, everything went catastrophically wrong. The conditions that evening were not calm, but they were also not unusual for that time of year. Brian himself, in the phone call he would make 3 days later to Blaine Stevenson, estimated the winds at around 20 miles per hour. He estimated the seas at about 3 feet. CBS News meteorologist Andrew Cook independently reviewed the weather conditions in Hopetown for that specific time window and described them as challenging for boating, with sustained winds of 15 to 25 knots and gusts, sometimes exceeding 40 miles per hour, along with a few scattered showers moving through the area. But Cook also noted something critical. The impact of those conditions in the shallow protected waters between the cays would have been significantly less severe than they would have been out on the open sea, so the conditions Brian described were real, they were documented. They were also, by every meteorological assessment, manageable for 2 experienced sailors in the stretch of water they were navigating. And then, somewhere in that 4-minute crossing, Lynette Hooker went into the water. The phrase Brian used to describe that moment, the specific verb he chose when speaking to his friends on that recording, has stayed with everyone who has heard it. He did not say she fell. He did not say she slipped. He told Blaine and Marn Stevenson, in his own voice, that Lynette basically just bounced off the dinghy. Bounced. That was the word. She basically just bounced off the dinghy in the middle of what he called a little blow. Winds of about 20 knots that had popped up during what should have been a half-mile trip back to their sailboat. If you are listening to this right now, and you have a theory about why someone would use the word bounced to describe their wife of 25 years going overboard into 3-foot seas at dusk, hold that thought. Because the words people choose under pressure are often the words investigators come back to later, and that single word choice is one of several linguistic details in Brian's account that forensic analysts and behavioral experts will likely examine closely if this case ever goes to trial. What Brian said happened in the seconds immediately after Lynette went over is a sequence that has now been reported by CNN, NBC News, CBS News, News Nation, and the Hookers' own hometown television station, WZZM 13, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. According to Brian, The dinghy key went into the water with Lynette. It had not been clipped to anything, and it had not been clipped to anybody. The spare dinghy key, the one that should have served as the backup in exactly this kind of situation, was inside Lynette's dry bag, and her dry bag was also with her when she went over. In the span of a single second, both keys were gone, the engine cut out, and the small craft, now without power, became subject entirely to the wind, which, by Brian's own estimate, was already blowing at 20 miles per hour. Lynette's daughter, Carly Alisworth, has publicly questioned that detail. She told CBS News directly that she does not understand how her mother ended up with the key at all, because Brian was always the one driving the dinghy. In all the years her mother and Brian had been sailing together, Brian was always the one in control of the engine, which meant Brian was always the one in charge of the key. The fact that Lynette had it in the exact moment she went overboard does not, in Carly's assessment, make sense. That question has not been answered. Brian has not addressed it publicly, and his attorney, Terrell Butler, has made no statement clarifying how the key ended up in Lynette's possession. The wind, Brian told the Stevensons on that 40-minute call, blew the two of them apart almost immediately. He said he believed Lynette had tried to swim back to the sailboat, back to Soulmate, which he estimated was about 1,000 yards away from where she went into the water. 1,000 yards is more than half a mile. That is the distance Brian believed his wife was attempting to swim, at dusk, in 3-foot seas, in 20-mile-per-hour winds, wearing whatever she had worn to dinner at a restaurant. Brian said he yelled to her. He said he told her he had lost an oar. He said he then threw the anchor out to try to hold his position. And then, on the recording, Brian told his friends a sentence that sailors around the world have stopped and replayed, trying to make sense of. He said he could not see Lynette anymore because, in his exact words, the moon had not risen yet. Hold that sentence in your mind. We are going to come back to it, because that sentence is one of the first places where what Brian said on the call stops lining up with what the physical world outside that call can confirm. In the minutes after Lynette went over, according to the account Brian gave, the rest of the disaster unfolded one piece of equipment at a time. Right after she went into the water, he told his friends he had thrown a flotation cushion toward her. He said he threw it as soon as he could reach for it, but he could not tell whether the cushion had reached her, and he could not tell whether she had grabbed it. Other transcriptions of the same recording, reported by multiple outlets, indicate that Brian told the Stevensons that Lynette did not get the cushion at all. Either way, the result was the same. She was in the water with no flotation device on her body, with 3-foot waves running between them, and with a wind strong enough to push them farther apart with every passing second. There is a small but significant detail about that flotation cushion that matters later. Richard Cook, the lead for the Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue Team, confirmed to news outlets covering this case that Lynette was not wearing a personal flotation device when she went overboard. Cook made that statement publicly, before the recording even surfaced. He also confirmed that searchers did, at one point, recover a flotation device that Brian said he had thrown to his wife. Brian himself left a voicemail for Carly, Lynette's daughter, telling her about that recovered cushion, telling her that the Hopetown Search and Rescue Team had found it, and that they could now focus their efforts in a smaller search area. So the cushion exists. The cushion was recovered. The cushion was, by Brian's own account, thrown, but Lynette did not have it, and on the night she went over, she was not wearing anything else that would float either. 2 flotation devices were on that dinghy. Neither one was on her body when the wind took her away. Then, Brian told his friends, one of the pins on his oar broke. With one oar gone and an engine that would not start, a small dinghy in 20-mile-per-hour wind does not row in a straight line. It spins, it drifts, it moves in whatever direction the wind and current take it. So Brian said he threw the anchor out. The sentence he used to describe that moment, the single breath in which he explained what was happening, is worth hearing exactly as he said it. He was trying to use the oar, and one of the pins on the oar broke, and the oar dropped over the side, and he was yelling for Lynette the whole time, and he yelled to her that he had lost the oar, and he threw the anchor out and anchored the dinghy and kept yelling, and he could not see her anymore because the moon had not risen yet. He yelled, he threw the anchor, he anchored the dinghy, he kept yelling, and he could not see her. By the time the anchor finally held, by the time the small craft was no longer drifting, Brian estimated he was a quarter to a half mile away from the spot where his wife had gone in. That is the moment, in his own voice on a call his friend was secretly recording, when Brian Hooker decided he had to leave that spot to go for help. He said he could not reach the nearest island by drifting. He said he would have to paddle. The next stretch of the recording is the section most often replayed by people analyzing this case, because it is dense with details that investigators are almost certainly examining closely. Brian told his friends he paddled. He told them that as he paddled, he saw several other boats moving through the area. He tried to signal them. He used the flashlight on his phone. He fired flares at 2 passing boats specifically, and he waved the phone flashlight at a third. According to his account, none of those boats turned. Not one of them saw him. By his own description, reported by NBC News, the paddling lasted 7 hours. 7 hours. It was inside that stretch of time that Brian also explained to his friends what his phone was doing during all of this. He said he had it on him. He said it did not work. He gave a specific reason. The phone, he explained, was only able to make calls over Wi-Fi, and out on the open water, no Wi-Fi was available. That single sentence is the only public explanation Brian Hooker has ever given for why he did not call 911, why he did not call the United States Coast Guard, why, for the next several hours, nobody on land or sea knew that his wife was in the water. He drifted, by his own account, for hours. He said he eventually washed ashore on marshland near the Marsh Harbor boatyards, a location he estimated was about 4 miles from the spot where Lynette had gone overboard. He said the police did not arrive to him until around 4 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, April 5th. By the time they arrived, by his own count, his wife had been in the water for roughly 8 hours. Near the middle of the call, Brian summed up what had happened in his own words. He told the Stevensons directly that the two of them had done so many things wrong. He grouped those failures, according to WZZM 13, into 3 categories: weather, equipment, and navigation. He told them, in a line that has been transcribed by almost every major outlet covering this case, that the whole evening had been a cascade of failures, and that it was something he was never going to forgive himself for. He said they had stayed too long at the restaurant. He said they had left in conditions that were too dark. And he said, inside that same confession, in a phrase we are going to walk past once and come back to later, that they had had no life jackets. Brian also told the Stevensons something that borders on a confession against his own interests. He said he had thrown the anchor out last instead of first. He said he could not explain why he had done it that way. He said he just knew that he hated the boat, and that if Lynette did not come back, he was never getting on it again. If you've been following True Crime Files, you know we don't just take someone's word for what happened. We pull the timeline apart, we check it against the science, we compare it to expert analysis, and we show you where the cracks start to appear. If this kind of detailed breakdown is what keeps you coming back, do us a favor right now and make sure you're subscribed, because cases like this one, where a single phone call unravels an entire narrative, are exactly what this channel was built for. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep going, because the contradictions are just starting to surface. That 40-minute recording is, in essence, what was on the call. On Wednesday, April 8th, at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening local time, the Royal Bahamas Police Force arrested Brian Hooker in Marsh Harbor, Abaco. The same day, the United States Coast Guard announced it had opened a separate criminal investigation. Brian was now in custody, no longer giving public statements. His attorney, Terrell Butler, was doing the talking. And somewhere in the days between the arrest, on April 8th and Friday, April 11th, Blaine Stevenson made the decision this case has been arguing about ever since. He took the recording he had made on April 7th, the 40-minute call Brian did not know had been captured, and he uploaded it to the Stevensons' own YouTube channel, a channel identified by WZZM 13 as Sailing Cameo. Once that file went live, every major news outlet covering the story obtained the audio from that channel: CBS, CNN, NBC, News Nation, Newsweek, Fox News Digital. The version of events Brian had given 2 friends in private became the version of events the entire world was now hearing, dissecting, and questioning. Stevenson has explained his decision to upload that recording on the record more than once. He told CNN he originally hit the record button because he was not familiar with that particular stretch of Abaco water and wanted to capture the place names Brian was about to describe so he could follow along on a nautical chart later. He told CNN he uploaded the file after Brian's arrest because Brian was now detained and could no longer speak for himself, and because the people searching for Lynette deserved every detail Brian had given about where and how she had gone into the water. He told CNN he believed the sailing community would be able to evaluate the account for itself if it could hear the specifics in Brian's own voice. With all the distances and wind speeds and navigational markers laid out clearly. And then, to News Nation, Stevenson gave a line that completely reframes the entire decision to go public. He said directly that he did not want Lynette to be found a week later and have it be identified that she had been alive in the water but had died of exposure instead of drowning. Read that sentence again, slowly. Stevenson is not saying he expects YouTube or the public to find Lynette. He is saying he does not want her found later, dead in a way that public pressure and an earlier, more aggressive search might have prevented. That is his stated reason, in his own words, for releasing a private conversation to the world. Brian's defense team has done exactly one thing in response to that recording, and it is the thing worth paying the most attention to. On April 11th, CNN sent an email to Terrell Butler asking directly whether the voice on the recording was her client. Butler replied that she could not confirm it. She did not deny it. She did not authenticate it. She did not accept it as evidence. She has said nothing further about the voice on the recording in the days since. When a defense attorney chooses not to confirm whether 40 minutes of audio belong to her client, she is not telling you the audio is fake. She is telling you she has read the situation clearly. Her job at that moment is not to authenticate evidence the prosecution might one day use in court. Her job is to leave that authentication process for someone else to handle in a courtroom under the rules of evidence, where challenges and objections and cross-examinations are possible. The legal posture is absolutely correct. The optics, however, are not, because to everyone watching, silence reads as confirmation. Now we come back to the moon. On the recording, when Brian explained to his friends why he could no longer see his wife in the water, he gave a specific reason. The reason was not the wind. The reason was not the waves. The reason was not that she had drifted out of his visual range. The reason he gave was that the moon had not risen yet. The problem with that explanation is that by Brian's own timeline, given on the same call, the math does not allow it. Lynette went into the water at around 7:30 in the evening local time. The sun, by Brian's own account, set about 10 minutes after that, putting sunset at approximately 7:40. What follows a sunset in the Bahamas in early April is not the pitch-black darkness of a moonless midnight. It is the soft, fading glow of a sun that has just dropped below the horizon, leaving the entire western sky illuminated for a significant period of time afterward. There is a technical term for that period of the evening. Sailors, pilots, and photographers call it civil twilight. Civil twilight is the stretch of time between sunset and the moment the sun reaches 6 degrees below the horizon. During civil twilight, the sky is still bright enough on land that artificial lighting is not yet required for most outdoor activities. You can read a book outside. You can see faces clearly. You can navigate without a flashlight. In the Bahamas in early April, civil twilight runs roughly 20 to 25 minutes after sunset. So at 7:40 in the evening on April 4th, when Brian, by his own account, was a quarter to a half mile from where Lynette had just gone over, the sky was still light, not bright, not noon, but light enough to make out a person in the water at 1,000 yards, the same distance Brian himself estimated between the incident site and their sailboat. A man who, by his friend's own description, is a former United States Marine, and who, by his own description to CBS News, has spent more than 12 years sailing with his wife, knows the difference between twilight and a moonless night. One does not arrive 10 minutes after a 7:30 sunset. The other does not arrive for hours. So when Brian told his friends the moon had not risen yet, he was describing a level of darkness the clock would not have delivered. That is the first place where what Brian said inside the recording stops matching what the world outside the recording can confirm. There are 3 more contradictions, and each one cuts deeper than the last. The second contradiction came from Mo Monestime, the charter boat captain who has spent 15 years working the waters around Great Abaco Island. Fox News Digital asked Monstein to do something very specific. They asked him to recreate, as closely as possible, the exact route Brian and Lynette had taken on the evening of April 4th. Monstein agreed. He took a boat out from the harbor across from the Abaco Inn, the same harbor the hookers had departed from at around 7:30. He turned southwest. He navigated between the western coast of Elbow Cay and the eastern coast of Lubber's Quarters. That narrow channel is the stretch of water Brian was describing to his friends on the Sailing Cameo recording. What Monstein told Fox News Digital about that stretch of water is the kind of detail an experienced local guide gives without even thinking about it, because to him it is simply obvious. The water, he said, is clear enough that you can see directly to the bottom from the deck of a boat. It is sometimes as shallow as 4 feet at low tide. At high tide, he estimated, it rises to about 10 feet. From 4 feet at low tide to about 10 feet at high tide. That is the depth of the water Brian and Lynette were in when, according to Brian's own account, a 20-mile-per-hour wind pushed them 1,000 yards apart and then pushed his dinghy another quarter to half-mile farther away. Brian's own navigational screenshots, maps he drew himself, and later provided to CBS News, confirm the same thing. The incident, by his own mapping, took place in water that is under 10 feet deep at high tide. Monstein did not stop at describing the depth. He gave Fox News Digital a longer observation about what kind of water that really is, and what it usually does when someone goes missing in it. The fact that Lynette had not been found, he said, was the real mystery. It is very hard, he explained, to disappear in water like that, because the boats are so close to land, the water is so shallow, and the visibility is so good. If someone falls overboard and drowns in that area, he said, somebody will see them the next day. He himself has driven boats through that channel hundreds of times and seen stingrays and sea turtles moving along the bottom from the deck of his vessel. He would see a human body. Somebody would say something. In his words, you could see land the whole way, the entire time. That observation becomes even more significant when you remember that the Bahamian search for Lynette Hooker has now stretched into its 3rd week. Authorities have rotated through extensive shoreline patrols, sea patrols, aerial drones, submersible drones, and as of Thursday, April 16th, cadaver dogs brought in specifically by the United States Coast Guard. Despite all of that effort, despite all of those resources, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force confirmed in a statement to ABC News that, in their exact words, these efforts have not resulted in the location of the missing individual. The water Brian described to his friends as the site of an open water disaster is water where, by every local expert measure, a body should have been recovered by now. And it has not been. The third contradiction is the phone. On the recording, Brian told his friends his phone did not work because it could only make calls over Wi-Fi, and there was no Wi-Fi available on the open water. On April 11th, Fox News Digital published the professional assessment of a telecommunications expert on exactly that claim. The expert is Dmitry Malinsky, the founder and chief executive of a telecommunications company called Intrat. Malinsky told Fox News Digital that cell phone coverage in the 4.5-mile channel Brian paddled through is, in his professional assessment, spotty but present. It is not zero. It is not a dead zone. It is not an area where no signal exists. Spotty service is not the same thing as no service. But the larger point about Brian's phone has nothing to do with what Brian remembers it doing that night. It has everything to do with what the phone carrier remembers it doing. Every cell tower his phone pinged, every connection it attempted, every Wi-Fi network it reached for, every GPS coordinate it logged. That record exists somewhere, sitting on a server, completely independent of whether Brian ever touched the screen or tried to make a call. Investigators with the right legal paperwork can pull that data. They may have already pulled it. When that data lands on a prosecutor's desk, it will either match what Brian told his friends on April 7th, or it will not. The United States Coast Guard's criminal investigation, the one opened the same evening Brian was arrested, is exactly the kind of investigation that subpoenas that data as a matter of standard procedure. The fourth contradiction is the strangest one, because it does not come from an outside expert at all. It comes from Brian himself. On the recording, Brian told his friends, in his own words, that he had thrown the anchor out last instead of first. He said he could not explain it. He said he just knew he hated the boat. Sit with what that sequence actually means in open water. When a person goes overboard from a small craft in wind and current, the anchor is the single most important thing that keeps you close to them. The anchor holds your position. The anchor stops the drift. The anchor is how you stay within sight of the person who needs you, long enough to pull them back in, or throw them something that floats, or signal a passing boat for help. Throwing the anchor last, after the dinghy has already been carried 1,000 yards away, after a pin has broken, after an oar has been lost, means that by the time the anchor finally grabs the bottom and holds, you are not anchoring where your wife is, you are anchoring where the current took you, which, by Brian's own estimate, was 1/4 to a half mile away from her. That is not somebody else's interpretation of Brian's account. That is Brian's own interpretation of Brian's account. And the man giving that account by his own friend's description is a former United States Marine, someone trained in emergency protocols and decision-making under pressure. There is a second sailor who has raised the same question about that anchor sequence on the public record, and his name is worth knowing because he was not a critic of Brian's, he was a friend. Daniel Danforth, a seasoned boater who told Fox News he had been friends with the hookers since 2003, went on Fox and Friends Weekend after hearing Brian's account secondhand, and said in his own words that the story did not add up. Danforth confirmed that Brian and Lynette were, in his assessment, very experienced boaters who knew what they were doing on the water. He raised one specific question that has hung over this case ever since. He asked why Brian, after losing sight of Lynette, did not return to Soulmate to check whether his wife had managed to swim back to the sailboat. By Brian's own account on the Sailing Cameo recording, that swim back to Soulmate was the exact thing he believed Lynette was attempting. By his own estimate, the sailboat was about 1,000 yards from where she went over. So the question Danforth raised on a national broadcast is the question every experienced boater has raised since, if your wife is trying to swim to your sailboat, the first place you go when you lose sight of her is the sailboat, not 4 miles away, not to marshland on a different island. The sailboat. Brian did not go to the sailboat. He paddled in the opposite direction, and the man who knew him for more than 2 decades said, on the record, that one decision alone did not match anything he knew about his friend. Which brings us to the one detail about that night that no experienced sailor anywhere has been able to explain. To see it clearly, you have to hold every single piece of this recording in one frame at the same time. Hold the frame. Brian himself gave CBS News on April 14th, the day after his release from custody. He told CBS he and Lynette had been sailing together for more than 12 years, living full-time on Soulmate for 4 of those years, calling the boat their floating home, describing their partnership, in his own voice, as more like CO captains, where there were certain jobs he did and certain jobs she did, because the boat was big enough that it took 2 people working together to run her efficiently. Hold the description Blaine Stevenson gave News Nation of who Brian had been before this happened. A former Marine, a former union leader, a man who had stood up for people in difficult political climates, a man with a reputation for being steady, reliable, someone who knew how to lead. Now, hold the water. 4 feet at low tide, about 10 feet at high tide. Clear enough, according to a charter captain with 15 years on those exact Ks, that he can see stingrays and sea turtles from the deck of his boat, land visible in every direction, the whole way across. Not open ocean, not a shipping lane, a shallow channel between 2 small islands with other boats moving through it the same evening. Now, hold the conditions, in Brian's own numbers. 20-mile-per-hour winds, 3-foot seas, the sun 10 minutes from setting, with civil twilight still glowing on the western horizon for at least another 15 to 20 minutes. A return route. They had completed some version of that same morning on the way out to Tahiti Beach and the Abaco Inn. And now hold the sentence. The sentence is 2 words long. Brian said them on the recording inside his own confession of failures, and we walked past them once on purpose. 2 words. No life jackets. Neither Brian nor Lynette Hooker had been wearing a life jacket when she went into that water. 2 CO captains with 12 years on the water together. 4 years of full-time live-aboard experience. a former Marine, who would have had water survival training drilled into him during his service. A nighttime dinghy ride in winds Brian himself estimated at 20 miles per hour, in 3-foot seas, with the sun about to disappear, water shallow enough to see the bottom, land close enough to reach in minutes. And the most basic safety rule a sailor learns on day one, the rule that is printed on the side of every dinghy and posted at every marina and repeated in every boating safety course in the country, was the first rule that was broken that night. There is no version of Brian's own framing of who he and Lynette were as sailors that explains why neither of them was wearing a life jacket on that ride. That is the single detail this entire recording cannot answer for itself. That is the single question that, more than any contradiction in the moon timeline, the phone explanation, or the anchor sequence, will sit at the center of whatever the United States Coast Guard's criminal investigation eventually produces. Because experienced sailors do not forget life jackets by accident, especially not at dusk, especially not in 20-mile-per-hour winds, and especially not when they are about to cross open water in an 8-foot dinghy with an outboard motor. There is one more piece of this recording that has to be addressed before we move to where the case stands today, and it belongs to the man who made the recording. On April 14th, when CNN and CBS and the rest of the major networks ran their full breakdowns of the sailing cameo call, Blaine Stevenson framed his decision to upload it in careful, almost protective language. He said he had done it for the searchers, for the sailing community, for a friend who could no longer speak for himself because he was in custody. By April 17th, 3 days later, when the Stevensons appeared together on News Nation, the tone had changed completely. Blaine said Brian needed to step up. He said he was not going to backseat quarterback Brian's decisions on the night itself, the night Lynette went over, but he absolutely would backseat quarterback everything Brian had done since. Marne Stevenson, Lynette's friend and confidant, the woman who had received those private messages about the marriage back in 2024, called Brian's decision to leave the Bahamas and return to the United States, in her exact word, disgusting. The friends who on April 14th were still framing Brian as a man unable to defend himself were, by April 17th, publicly losing faith in the man whose recording they had released to the world. Where does the case stand today? It has now been 18 days since Lynette Hooker went into the water off Elbow Cay. Brian Hooker is back in the United States. He flew to Atlanta on the afternoon of April 15th to be at the bedside of his critically ill mother. According to his attorney, he has not been charged with a crime. He denies any wrongdoing. The United States Coast Guard's criminal investigation, opened on April 8th, remains active. The Bahamian search has stretched into its third week, with shoreline patrols, sea patrols, aerial drones, submersible drones, and the cadaver dogs the Coast Guard brought in on April 16th. As of this recording, Lynette's body has not been found. Lynette's daughter, Carly Ellisworth, has flown to the islands with her boyfriend, Steve Hansen, to lead her own independent push for answers. Carly told ABC News on April 19th that she had doubted Brian's story from the very beginning. In her own words, she said she did not understand how her mother had drowned or got floated away in water that shallow, that clear, that close to land. The questions, she said, kept coming back to Brian. Why did he not do this? Why did he not do that? Why did that happen? She has since met with both the United States Coast Guard and the Bahamian authorities. Hansen told ABC News they had given a full statement to local police and were planning to retrace Lynette's last known steps themselves. Hansen also told ABC News something quieter, something that has stuck with people who have heard it. He said neither of them was going to argue that Brian did not deserve to see his mother before she died. They were just saying that Carly did not get that option. Carly did not get the option to see her mother before she died. And in that one sentence, given to a national outlet by the man standing next to Lynette's daughter in a foreign country 2 weeks into a search that has produced nothing, the emotional heart of this case sits fully exposed. Brian wanted his account out there. Stevenson wanted Brian's account out there too. The recording is the same recording. The only question left is which of the two men, on April 7th, understood better what was actually on it. If something about what you just heard moved you, or if you have a theory about why two experienced CO captains went out in an 8-foot dinghy at dusk with no life jackets, drop it in the comments below. And if investigations like this, where we go deep into the timeline, the science, and the contradictions that everyone else glosses over, are the reason you're here. Then make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Files and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next development, in this case the moment it breaks. Because this case is far from over. And when the next piece of evidence surfaces, we'll be the first to walk you through exactly what it means.